to the front of the net. Puck work to the outside to Eklund. Howe back to Eklund again. Kerr sparring with Stevens in front. Eklund creeps behind. Out in front to Curry. Scores! Tim Kerr and the Flyers are perfect on 5-on-3s. They are 3 for 3. Get their first power play goal of the night and tie the game.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah. Just reminding you that FlyersNittyGritty.com and the O&B Puckcast are brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. Hey, do you have damage to your home? Not sure who to call? We suggest that you call Summit Public Adjusters before your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be very stressful. Let Summit take the stress out of the claims process. From storm damage to your roof, to toilet overflows, to broken pipes and fires, Summit gets you the most money for your repairs. So next time Mother Nature leaves you in need of repairs, call Summit Public Adjusters at 215-752-0560 or visit summitpublicadjusters.com. Licensed in PA and New Jersey.
And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast, episode number 187. The PR tour is on full blast from the Philadelphia Flyers' new hierarchy, and we're going to get into that. This is an off-season preview from the Puckcast people here that you've entrusted to listen to roughly 100 and, well, I guess counting specials, 190 plus episodes. You have a lot of experience with, and we have a special guest tonight. I should say that Dan Silver may or may not be able to join us tonight. He has some work obligations. If he can, he's going to come in and do us Friedman-style CarCast. But I do have along with me, always to my left, his name is Chef B. How are you, man?
Very good, gentlemen. Nice to speak about a little hockey. Enjoying these playoffs and now the Cup. Yeah, it's going to be a good Cup. Hopefully going to be a good Cup series. I hope it ain't like some of these conferences. It's a little one-sided, but still enjoyable.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could dip into that. I mean, it looks like pretty clear that it's going to be Vegas and the Florida Panthers. However, the 75 Islanders did beat the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the Flyers did beat the Boston Bruins in 2010. So, I mean, things do happen, but I won't be counting my chickens on that one. So, but before we introduce our guest, just a reminder that the O&B Puckcast is on several podcast platforms, including all the ones that you're aware of: Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, Amazon Audible, Google. We have a YouTube page. Just plug in their O&B Puckcast. And, of course, we have a Facebook page. You can follow the O&B Puckcast. We can be followed on Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. Also on Getter, just a backup platform. Sometimes you get a little salty over there at O&B Puckcast, at O&B Puckcast. If you could rate and, importantly, subscribe or follow whatever is appropriate for your platform, we really would appreciate it because it moves us up the charts when people are looking for a Philadelphia Flyer podcast, and we really, truly do appreciate it. And without any further ado, let us introduce back with us from 97.3 ESPN, Flyers Insider. He also has a wonderful podcast, YWT, you would think. You would think I would remember that. His name is Kevin Durso.
What's up, guys? Great to be back, as always.
Yeah, it's great to have you along. So I don't really think we had the opportunity with the way events sequenced for you to weigh in on our show. You've been a frequent guest and one, among our favorites. What do you think of the Flyers' front office structure, number one, and the messaging, and maybe the plan that they seem to be alluding to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to digest with it, and for me, it was a little bit of a hectic time to digest all of it because I was, let's put it this way, the day before my sister's wedding was the day that the press release came out, right? So like I'm kind of engulfed in a lot of things at that moment and still trying to digest this new direction, this new era, and all of that type of stuff that they were talking about. I think at first, when the reports came out about Keith Jones specifically, because it kind of, and we saw a lot of the people who had the reports out, Elliot Friedman specifically, who kind of said, look, they kept it really hush hush about new entries into this thing. A lot of names were out there at the beginning, and then we didn't know a whole lot of details, and they really kept things close to the vest. And am I surprised by it? Not necessarily, because I think that when it came down to it, what we kept hearing about what they want the job of president to be, if they want him to be kind of a PR specialist, so to speak, and have an effective way of communicating, he can do a lot worse than a guy who broadcasts on national games. I think he can do a lot worse than that. But I do think that there's also, listen, there's many ways that you can take all of this. And I think the two emotions that come to mind for me are cautious optimism and frustration, because the cautious optimism is the messaging finally sounds congruent across all parts. You had 5 people sit up there at a press conference, and for the first time in a long time, everybody was speaking the same language. So that's cautious optimistic for me, is at least everybody sounds like they're on the same page and moving forward in a direction that everyone agrees upon. The frustration is, why didn't we get here sooner than this? That's where the frustration should come from. It was pretty obvious that this is what they had to do for a long time. Maybe longer than even others want to admit. We can go back over the course of the last decade and probably pick out multiple points where you could start this thing and not steer away from the course of it. But really, after the 2021 season, that was where, okay, you tried something, you got all these new people in place and all this, or 2021-22 is what I should say, that you had that big 2021 off season. Then the 21-22 season didn't work out the way that you wanted it to with all those new additions. Ryan Ellis is hurt the whole year. It didn't work out with Cam Atkinson and Rasmus. Those guys didn't turn your franchise around immediately. So when it didn't work out, you really had a reason to make significant changes then and there. And instead you went through another offseason with the same general manager and got similar results, and finally came to the realization of what was happening in March of 2023. That should have happened a long time ago. And that's what the frustration should be, that the realization of saying rebuild, going through with a process, kind of deriving this plan, explaining a plan, explaining how you need to get back to the basics of things, and get back to the basics, not of building a team completely, but building back the interest in the franchise for that matter. All of that should have been done a long time ago. So, I stand on both sides of this kind of in a way where, yes, am I skeptical of some of the things that are involved with this? Sure, I am. Like I've said, I got kind of some comments about, what are you talking about inexperienced? Danny Briere is an experienced hockey guy, and so is Keith Jones, and that's great. I admire them for their knowledge, and I think that they are very smart people. But I don't know if Danny Briere can sign a good contract or draft a good player or, negotiate with free agents or make trades. I don't know any of that because he has no track record as an NHL GM. So we're going to find that out on the fly. And the same thing goes for Keith Jones. We don't know if he can be an executive and be an effective executive for a franchise. We're going to learn as we go, but I'm willing to give it a shot because at least it sounds like finally there is some harmony in terms of where this thing is going. And finally, that message that we heard from John Tortorella months ago about building the foundation, not even having the foundation in some cases. Finally, everybody else is talking like that and speaking that language and talking about it from a business standpoint as well, that you've got to really make some significant repair. So all of that sounds good to me as they move forward. It's just a matter now of taking all of the good words that are being said and turning it into the next step, which is actions.
Yeah, sure. And the other aspect of this, and some people have overlooked the fact that, John Tortorella really was the catalyst for this. He came in and kept it real, if you will. And he's, as a result, going to have a little bit more say, especially given to what you're talking about with regard to the lack of experience of Briere and Jones in their respective positions. Tortorella is going to have a say in the kind of players they're going to be drafting, trading for, and all that. And that has its positives and its negatives. And I'm just wondering over time if there's going to be a divide, and how much what does this mean? Does this mean Tortorella does see his way in the future as a front office executive? I mean, because how much can you invest in a 63, 64-year-old coach? So there are still some murky aspects to this.
Yeah, and that's part of where some of my skepticism comes from too, because this doesn't happen frequently. Coaches don't get this kind of involvement from a front office perspective, and vice versa. We don't usually see this that often. And I think that the hint of this was out there from the end of the regular season when he's watching games away from the bench, and he had his perspective of watching from the press box, obviously, and I digress on that because that's my viewpoint most nights, so I digress on his opinion of that. But nonetheless, it's different, right? It's very different to see a guy who's been a head coach for his entire career at this point. He wasn't a player at that level, or at least a long-term player at that level. So to step away and say, you know what, even though all of my time is around the bench and that's my area, let me step away and have conversations with what I guess now was obviously is known as the future GM of the team. They pretty much made that clear. Nobody else was considered for the GM job. It was Danny Briers, and that was final. But that was already starting those conversations. And I guess where my skepticism comes from is, just what kind of harmony is there going to be going forward with this, and what happens when you do hit those points of disagreement in terms of evaluating a player or what type of player you want. Because I kind of, I think a lot of us have this preconceived notion of the type of player that is a John Tortorella type player. And you're not going to build an entire team in today's game that way. You just can't. So either there's got to be, and I do think Tortorella's evolved a little bit over the years in terms of knowing what to have on his team. I think he knows you can't just throw a bunch of grinders out there and tough guys out there and expect to win the Stanley Cup. It's not going to happen. But he also has to, and seems to understand, that this doesn't get built overnight. You don't get the skill guy who scores 40 goals a year tomorrow, not from where the Flyers are. That doesn't happen tomorrow. It could happen down the line. You got to be patient with that. You got to draft a lot of players to get maybe somebody who hits in that realm, and you got to wait for the opportunity when you're in a position to go out and maybe even sign that player if that's what it comes to. That's certainly what happened when he was coaching in Columbus. You wait it out, you acquire players. Eventually you end up with, a Vezina winning goaltender and a clear-cut skill player like Artemi Panarin and, all that type of stuff. You get players like that over time, but it doesn't happen the day that you take the job. And I think that's something that Tortorella realizes. I just hope that he doesn't have that much influence on the team to the point of it's a bunch of those types of players that I think we associate with his style of coaching, because I don't think that gets you anywhere. And, one of the funny things was I talked about the need to have speed and skill, and I think that's evident. I think anybody watching the playoffs can see that. And one of the comments that I had to get met with is, so you want to build the Toronto Maple Leafs? How'd that work out? And my answer to that would be, no, I don't want to build the Toronto Maple Leafs, because I wouldn't be giving 3 or 4 players half of the salary cap. That's another way to not build it. You do need speed and skill, and you need to have effective players, but you don't give half of your salary cap to 4 players and expect the rest to fall into place either, because when it dries up for those 3 or 4 players, chances are it dries up for everybody because they're not as skilled as those 3 or 4 players. So no, I don't want to build the Toronto Maple Leafs. I totally value what Carolina and Florida have built and what Dallas and Vegas have built. I totally value that, because there's balance involved. You definitely need, not necessarily enforcers by the traditional sense, but you need guys who grind it out, who give that energy level, who can be a tough guy when needed to be and step in those situations and play with some physicality in the playoffs, because that's part of the playoff equation. It's speed and skill, but it's also grit and grinding it out and physicality and all of that. It's everything put together. And oh, by the way, really good goaltending if we haven't figured that out in the playoffs also. You need that too. Yeah. So
of course,
everything needs to be blended together. And I just hope that it's not too one-sided for Tortorella, that you get too many players of the same makeup.
Yeah, you got it, Chef.
Well, I'm going to go a little on the side, I guess, towards his side here, because he's consistently said now, when he evaluated his team, he said bringing Johnny Gaudreau in here wouldn't have done any good, and what he has here, the talent is not good enough. He said that. He said it on numerous occasions. And I think, he's gonna talk about getting rid of some players to add players, addition by subtraction kind of thing. So you can be the scoring type of player that flies around that we're seeing in the playoffs. I think if we looked at some of those guys in the playoffs, you could say, oh, he would do well under Tortorella. He would do well under Tortorella. There's several guys on the Panthers and the Vegas teams I could easily see playing for John Tortorella. I don't think that's the issue. I just think if there's going to be any dissension or bickering, I guess, with the big three or five, if you're including Val and, Dan Hilt. So if that's the case, I think it'll be like, oh, he might want to hang on to one person more than the other two would. Example being, I don't know, and I'm not saying he does and he doesn't, but like let's just say Ristolainen, because he seemed like he was able to change him and mold him and get him to be a better player and develop him more. And if he sees that, he can do that. And now the key is, can he maintain that another season? And if he's going to do that, so if he sits there and go, all right, we got to deal with San Jose for that, that second pick they have, like at 26, we could send him and something else, blah blah blah, and we get it. I'm more concerned that John's going to go, yeah, you know what? I want to keep that guy. I want to keep that player. I'd be more curious to see how much how much pull he has keeping somebody, because his own words were addition by subtraction.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point, and I think that something else, because I'm trying to read between the lines of some of his comments throughout the year as well. And
yes,
I also look at a lot of the players that he gravitated to over the course of the season, and expressing the need, like not just the need, but addition by subtraction, like you brought up, Chef, but also this sense that they're going to be younger. Well, he gravitated towards Noah Cates a lot. And then toward the end of the year, you saw him do it with Owen Tippett. You saw him do it with Tyson Forster. That tells me he does understand that guys who don't necessarily go out and throw the body around a ton are still valuable to him on this team. And you can do the same thing with Ristolainen and say, listen, you need a guy who's a physical presence, but I think you need to evaluate everything. And I hope that that's where Danny Briere and Keith Jones can come in and help out a little bit with this, in a sense that just because you started to get something out of them, you have to look big picture with the rebuilds. If somebody's out there willing to take Rasmus Ristolainen right now, it's probably more beneficial to get with, especially if it's to the level of another first round pick, let's just say. You need to be willing to take what you can, not even just what you can get. If you're going to get that kind of return for a guy who's in his late 20s, who by the time his contract's up will be in his 30s, by the time this rebuild is over will be in his 30s. Is it all worth it? Or is it worth it to take a shot on another first round pick if you can get it? Those are the things where Tortorella can't be attached to certain guys if you can get something for him. Do I think that that's what they're going to get for Ristolainen right here and now? Probably not with the contract, but there's going to be times where this comes up, and that's where you have to just not be so attached to specific style of players because you like what they bring when you're rebuilding. And if you're rebuilding, then the main thing you should be focused on is clearing cap space and accruing draft capital. That's really the two areas where you do the most improving and most addition right now. Is you should be adding cap space and adding draft capital. Those are the two areas where you should really be looking at the most. So if that's where the opportunity lies, that's what I would dive in head first with just about every opportunity. If you get an offer you can't refuse on any player, especially one who's got term left, I think you have to explore it. So hopefully that's where, even if there are some disagreements, and I agree with Tortorella when he said, that the disagreements and arguments that they could have are going to be healthy. I agree with that. I think it's good to not be so like-minded in the approach that this way, I don't want Danny Briere to say something and have a bunch of yes men around him, and same for Tortorella and same for Keith Jones. I don't want people to yes them to death and go along with one person's plan. If this is going to stick and if this is going to work, then you need to keep everybody involved and everybody in the loop and everybody who seems to have key roles in the decision-making to all be on the same page when you make those decisions.
Yeah. Another name that comes to mind, especially as we jump ahead, just within the context of our discussion point here, a player like Scott Lawton would seem to have a lot of value at the trade deadline, right? Mm-hmm. And yet he's a torch guy, and he's kind of like the prototypical kind of player, is more or less the unofficial captain. And yet guys like that, you saw with players like Paul Stasny would get moved all the time. So this is where we're going to put that to the test. Like, who is essential? And where Briere is going to be like, you get a first-round draft pick at the trade deadline, even if it's in the 20s for a guy like Lawton, and you're still trying to take a swing at some of these higher-end talents when you need a first-line center. You need a top-pairing defenseman. And there's guys who have proven you can get players like that, even in the second round. You look at Braden Point, you look at later in the first with Pasternak. You got to go for it. If you're in a rebuild, that's going to be the test, right?
It is, and something that I find really interesting from Danny Briere's perspective, and maybe from Keith Jones a little bit as well, less so John Tortorella, because John Tortorella's only got 1 year of everything with this. So I don't think in certain extents his attachment level should be too high. Like, I'm worried about him being attached to a certain type of player versus specific players per se.
Right.
With the other two, especially kind of Briere to an extent, because let's put it this way. I'll give you two names that I can for fact say that, he toward the end of Danny Briere's playing career, Sean Couturier is part of his teammate, and Scott Lawton's making his NHL debut in a season where Danny Briere is still a Flyer. That's where you have to separate yourself from the personal side of things, because I'm sure that we know Scott Lawton's a great guy, and we know that, what he brings to a locker room is great for a team. But that's where you got to separate, and Briere knows that firsthand because he's watched him grow as a player pretty much from start to finish and was his teammate at one point in time. And Keith Jones, as a broadcaster locally, has seen it from day one. But you got to separate yourself from that. This is the business side of it. And if you've got a good offer out there for anybody, you have to explore it. Is there reasons to keep guys like that? Sure, there is, especially if you come to a certain point where the rebuild is speeding up in its process and you're nearing the end of it, and one of those types of players can come out on the other side. Then you explore keeping players like that if they're helping the process along. But if you're in the early stages of it and you've got guys who have value, look, I like Scott Lawton a lot. I like him as a part of the locker room. But when, let's remember there was a deadline not too long ago where his contract was up and Chuck Fletcher said it came down to the wire, but they decided to re-sign him. Sure looks good kind of now in the sense of you need somebody who kind of keeps morale up in this room right now when the word rebuild is actually being thrown around. But was that a missed opportunity in the same way that the following year it was Rasmus Ristolainen? You didn't have to re-sign him, but you chose to, and you could have gotten something. If you were really rebuilding, that's what you would have done. So, it's probably, I don't want to say it's too late now for Lawton because he's coming up on the end of that contract again. So you're going to be revisiting that. And he's got a very cap friendly deal, I would say, compared to other guys on the team. So that one's a little bit different. But I think you missed and I've said this to you guys before, I think you missed an opportunity with Ristolainen to get something back when you gave up so much to just get him on, onto your books for one season, and now you have him on the books for longer, obviously. And I don't know if I see the merit of that entering a rebuild. He's not going to be, as far as I'm concerned, he shouldn't be part of the, the end result of the rebuild. By the time his contract is up, you got 4 more years left of that. By the time it's up, he's going to be in his early to mid 30s. What does that do for your rebuild per se? He's going to be one of those guys that you're probably, again, when it's over, looking for the replacement for that guy eventually, if he even sticks the whole contract, because obviously we'll see what happens there. So there's a lot of things to consider with that. And yes, I think in particular, though, Lawton's a great example of the difficult decisions that come with this. I think there's plenty of guys that we can look at and say, this seems like an easy one. This is a guy who, if they can, they would like to. And maybe the only question marks we have for it are the contract. Lawton's got a good contract, and he's a good player in the locker room. He's good for his teammates. But you may have to make that tough decision when it comes down to it, especially if it nets you a good draft pick, if it nets you maybe a prospect in return. Who knows? I mean, we'll see what kind of, like I said, we're going to see as we go what kind of negotiating skills Danny Briere has. If you get an offer you can't refuse, as much as you like Scott Lawton, you may have to consider it. So that's the tough part of the job.
Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind as they're doing these interviews, and they're very good at putting across the message and re-emphasizing and recapitulating the talk about the collaboration and teamwork and speaking with one voice. That's good. But other things have leaked out, particularly one that caught my attention and many others. Keith Jones talking about, he believes very strongly about building from the back end out and putting an emphasis on that decor and talking about teams like Florida and like Vegas and how those, and then Dallas, of course, that missed opportunity on that special day. We chose Nolan Patrick, and apparently it was Miro Heiskanen was actually the player that the scouting staff liked, not so much Makar. But I digress. I'm wondering, as we come up to the draft, and you have players like David Reinbacher and Axel Sandin Pellikka, who are good players, but probably only second pair level ceiling. Are they going to make that mistake? Is Jones going to be in the ear of Briere? And are they going to make that reach for position as opposed to, hey, you got an opportunity with these forwards. Some of these guys could be a first line player. Has some of that been on your mind as well?
Certainly, because these are the decisions when you have top 10 picks. And, look, I know that for a lot of people out there listening, the goal at the beginning of the season was higher than 7th. And I get that. But 7th is still a place where you can make an impact, especially, for me. And I would argue this a lot is I don't think that this team has necessarily drafted poorly at all over the years, even going back to, some of the, Sanheim in 14, Provorov, Konechny in 15, all of that. I think that there's a lot of picks they've made that they got praise for a reason. These are players that people thought had bigger potential. And I think that the shortcoming of the Flyers in general is what happens next. It's the development of the player. I think that they've drafted fairly well, all things considered, because if they didn't, then why was all that praise out there? You had scouting, the other NHL scouting departments telling you that they had a really good draft, and these are types of players that should be able to make an impact. And some of them have, but more or less the rest of them have kind of fallen into that middle of the pack, just like the rest of the team has. So I think that's the biggest area. And when you pick a player, and I think that right now for the stage of the rebuild that they're in, very much like last year, and we can, again, this is debatable at this time, because when you have 1 year of time from the draft to what we're seeing now, you can weigh the options that were sitting there on the table. And the two that people are going to go to the most is what the Flyers did at 5th last year with Cutter Gauthier, and who went 6th, which was David Jiricek.
Yes.
They're going to look at those two, and you're going to compare, and you're going to see where they're at, and you're going to see what they do. But for the most part, the approach, especially in this stage of things, is usually best player available. You just need to build it in general, and you never know because you never know what you're going to find. Sometimes, let's look at another guy who's actively playing right now, because Gauthier is obviously in World Championships. Let's look at another player who's actively playing. Ronnie Attard was not a first-round pick. He was a third-round pick. Sometimes you got to develop that into something that fits your lineup. You can't just go out and get a bunch of – usually, if you're lucky, you have 2 first-round picks because you did something right in terms of acquiring that draft capital like I talked about.
Oh, you mean like St. Louis's Doug Armstrong?
Exactly. But most of the time you're a team that has 1 first-round pick, and you can be picking 5th overall, 13th overall, 25th overall. You may be able to find something that turns out to be a star player. We've seen this. You bring up. I heard you brought up David Pastrnak. That's not a top 10 pick, but he's probably a top 5 player in the league, or pretty close to it, right? Like. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's that level player because you know what to do with them after you draft him. You take a 25th overall pick and you mold it into something that becomes, and sure, look, do you have some help playing him with a future Hall of Famer like Bergeron and another star player in Marchand? Absolutely you do. But he's also become that good on his own. And that's the reflection of really good, beyond just good scouting, it's good development too. That's the reflection of both departments coming together, finding the player, and then knowing what to do with him after he gets here, and you actually start to get your hands on him. Because I even look at Gauthier that way, because realistically speaking, they haven't had a chance to get their hands on him yet. But the only thing they've been able to do is probably advise whether or not playing in college is the better move or not. And he's going back to Boston College for his sophomore season, which I find is the right decision for him. I think that he's going to benefit from it way more than AHL time or NHL time next season right away. I think that's where I think you need to start with this. And up until then, he's being coached by somebody else. And sure, maybe the Flyers can get into the ear of the coaching staff at BC and say, we really want to, play him at center because we want to mold him as a center or whatever, maybe, like I'm sure that conversations like that happen a little bit because you're checking in on prospects and everything like that. But I think in terms of approaching the draft, sure, are the defensemen going to be intriguing because of what we've heard? Probably. I just don't know. Everything that I've seen so far is very forward heavy. And I think you guys seem to agree with that it's been very forward heavy. And, I know that one of the popular names that's floating around because I think, obviously now that we know they're picking 7th, at least as of today, obviously things can change in one way or another. A lot of time still to go between now and draft night. But obviously Bedard's going first, and then you've got a handful that are going to go in the top tier that the Flyers probably won't be able to get to. And then there's this big opening where you just see a bunch of names. But I know Zach Benson's name has come up a lot, and I've seen the clips of him. And the clips are obviously everything to a lot of people because it's the highlights, right? You don't get the moments where the development is still needed to his game, but you got to love the raw ability. And sometimes if that's the best player available that's sitting there when you're picking at 7, as much as you want to build up the back end a lot, and I agree, it's a key part of having a championship team in this league. Sometimes you also got to go and get the player who you think is going to make the biggest impact on your team over the long haul. Again, big picture thinking, you might be able to build out that back end in different ways as you get closer to the end of the rebuild, but you might want that foundational piece. If you think that you can draft it at 7, if you think that it's the raw talent is already foundational, and if you think you can mold it into something even bigger, because, again, I refer to Pasternak in this case because presumably when Boston makes that pick at 25th overall, they think they're getting a really good player because you're using your first round pick on him. So you think you're getting something good. Maybe you don't think first line. Maybe you're thinking second line because that's probably what the projections are at the time. But as you work with them and as you see the ability and you say, you know what, maybe there's still something we can unlock here. And that's when you get star players that are more finds. That's when you get players who turn out to be something bigger than what their draft position says they are. I think we put so much stock into who went first, who went 4th, who went 7th, who went 10th, and sometimes lose sight of the fact that some of the best players in this league weren't even first-round picks, weren't second-round picks sometimes. That it's the guys who turn out to be the ones that worked the hardest at their development, took all the advice and took all the teaching and applied it, and the teams that focus so heavily on development. So all of that, I think, applies when you're looking at this draft position. But I think it's a great point to talk about when it comes to the draft, about where they're going to go. And again, as much as they want to focus on the back end and the importance of building a back end over time, I think you've got to look carefully at this draft and realize that if the best available is a forward, you probably have to go forward and take what you think is going to be more foundational than worry about drafting for a need and wanting to build the back end and hoping that maybe the guy you take turns out to be a second pairing guy. I think you got to swing for the fences and then put in the work to turn him into what you think he can be.
No, absolutely. You think about a player like Jamie Benn just got a 2-game suspension for his Bertuzzi imitation on the back of was it Petrangelo?
No, it was Mark Stone.
It was Mark Stone, right? Yeah. So he was a 5th-round draft pick in 2007. Mm-hmm. So I mean, the examples of what you're talking about abound. Chef?
Yeah, I was bringing up, since we're talking about the back end so much. Let's talk about the back end of this first round. There are a lot of opportunities here, and you spoke to briefly when we first started, both of you did, about that 7th pick and possibly moving up. I doubt they'll be able to, but you never know unless that last minute thing comes in. But more realistically speaking, they got opportunities to pick up. There are several other teams that have double picks, or as Isaiah said early on, teams that are in a win now sort of thing that you can make deals with. So what would it take? Like example, I'm just going to take the Blue Jackets. They got 22. I'm not even going to talk Arizona because I don't even know what's going on in Arizona. I don't think anybody is. You trade somebody out there or a pick out there. It could be they could be playing on sand next year. Who knows? But like you got Columbus and San Jose have realistic. They both have early picks. They both have a chance. They both need help too. So, what do you think it takes that maybe the Flyers could get? What kind of trade could they make to get that? And I pose that question to both of you. What do you think is realistic that would happen that they could get 22 and 27?
I think the lack of a second round pick is hurting them in this spot, because I think you would need to be able to allow a team to move into the second. It's why, I brought up both scenarios, move up or back. Move back is way more likely. I don't think they've got anything close to make a deal to move up. I think they would be, you'd be getting into pretty heavy territory if you were trying to move up, because then you don't have enough draft capital right now to be able to do that. And this is where, this is where I keep going. I don't mean to harp on these deals that were made in the past, but it's where I keep going with everything you gave up for Rasmus Ristolainen, because you gave up two defensemen and 4 draft picks to make that happen. Or the Tony DeAngelo trade that was 3 draft picks. There's your capital. And again, this is why I like bringing it full circle with the start of our conversation about the way that this all played out and what all this means, and why I think frustration is a key part of it. Because take even just this past the prior offseason leading into the 22-23 season out of play, and maybe the Ristolainen trade would have already been made. Even let's say the re-signing was already made. All right, you can't go back and erase that when and what Chuck Fletcher did then, but you could have taken him out of the role a year ago before the 22 off season, before going into the 22-23 season, and possibly avoided a trade of for DeAngelo where you're giving up 3 draft picks just to get the rights to sign him. Yeah. And because I don't think that a team, if you would have gotten to the point where the Flyers are now and talking about rebuild and talking about kind of having patience through the process and all of that type of stuff, I don't think you're making a trade for DeAngelo. I don't think you're doing that. That fit the aggressive retool conversation, not the rebuild conversation. So if you would have pivoted a year ago, you might have 3 more draft picks to work with. And maybe as you're looking at this year's draft, you have something to go off of, because you mentioned 2 good ones, Chef. I think that, Columbus is obvious, and Columbus and San Jose are 2 really good examples. I would also throw in, and the Flyers have some good, have some trade. There's trade history here. I'll say it that way. Some of it's not always the best. But Nashville has 2 picks in the latter half of the draft. And again, maybe you would entice a team like that with a second pick later in the draft to go and move down. What are we talking? 10 spots. If you had a good second round pick, go into the 30s instead of being in the 20s, but you don't have that.
To be specific, I was talking about, like, example being Columbus. And I was thinking more on the lines of you picking up. What capital do you have now to pick up their second? Like, if you're listening to the rumors that Hayes wants to go back there, what kind of package does it take to send Hayes and whatever's necessary over there to get that pick? And straight up, just the pick.
And the best piece
that's what I was talking about.
Oh yeah, and they don't have a lot of capital for it. Probably the best piece that you could throw in, especially given the way things are playing out as we speak, would be, you've got a 2024 first round pick from Florida that probably would be at the back end of the 24 draft that you could potentially say, let's try to pass that along with a player who they could utilize and see if that's going to. I don't think it would be good enough, but that's probably the best draft capital trade chip that they have, is that 24 first. If you're trying and if you're trying to get back into the first round in 23, then I understand utilizing it in that spot. Yeah. I'd always said from the beginning when they acquired that pick that one way or another, Chuck Fletcher wasn't going to make that pick. And it was either going to be because of what actually has happened, which is he's no longer employed by the team, or it was going to be that he was going to get desperate enough down the line that it was getting traded anyway. And maybe both things can be true potentially, because I'm not, in the long run, but it's probably at this point, considering that you're not going to trade the 23 first that you've got, unless you're moving back to get more capital because the board shakes out a good way for you, at that point, again, I don't know if there's anybody, actually, that's a potential, like maybe that's where a potential spot comes in where, maybe at 7th, I don't know what Nashville will be looking at, but Nashville's got 15 and 24 and you've got 7. Would you talk to them then about that? Is moving up 8 spots for somebody in the top 10 worth 2 first rounders later? I don't, for the Flyers, I don't think it's worth it, because I think you need an impact guy.
You need that impact player. You're right.
And I don't think you're going to find it. You're going to get 2 nice players at 15 and 24, not necessarily straight up impact. But
and it's not exactly the same, but they've already experienced that phenomenon when they passed on Caulfield, and they got York and Brink. And while York definitely looks like a nice NHL player, I'd rather have Caulfield. And Brink looks like he'll have some type of NHL career, but he also could be the kind of guy who leads the AHL in scoring for many years and never really makes the impact at the top level. So you just don't know. Before we go too deep in that direction, I did want to ask you, Kev, because you did talk about development and all that. And Danny Briere has been out there talking about some of the improvements that they need to make organizationally. And I'm wondering, have you heard anything about how Briere is going to attack that and talk about some of the areas that the organization is weak? Is he going to bring in a different kind of, or better, or add to the development staff? Any names or anything? I've heard Alan McCauley was probably going to get the GM job for Lehigh Valley, but I haven't heard much else in terms of attacking some of those areas you referred to earlier.
No, I think that, I don't have many names on that front either. The McCauley thing definitely had merit to it. They haven't obviously formally gone that direction, but that had merit to it. But I do think that there's a lot of, at this stage of where the franchise is, especially coming off of all of the big announcements that they made and doing the PR tour they're doing now. I feel like I can at least read between the lines and kind of listening to that, Briere talking about every area is going to be addressed and things like, and I feel like I can at least fairly speculate which areas I think need the most improvement and things of that nature. Because again, like I said, I think their drafting has been good. Like, I think that over the years, especially the Hextall years, when there was a lot of praise being heaped on these draft classes they had, I don't think that was for nothing. I think that they just, between injuries and overall development, and injuries can kind of go back to another, can be an area that you need to improve upon as well, because maybe that's conditioning. Maybe that's the conditioning. And obviously the Flyers have done a lot with their training staff over the last several years. So maybe that was an area that was already addressed in that sense. But I think that player development is probably one of the main areas. And I think that without giving a specific area directly in his answer, I think that that's part of the equation. I think that analytics is part of the equation. And because I think that goes hand in hand. It all kind of really goes hand in hand. Your scouting, your drafting, your player development, your analytics. I think it all goes hand in hand. It all comes into play because it all really needs to be working well. And certainly, I don't think Danny Briere is naive to the fact that, if your analytics department, or part of it anyway, or your interpretation of analytics is, we entered a trade into the computer and it told us it was a good value, so that's what we're going with. I think that's that
no more
probably
apps. No apps, right. No more maps.
So I think that might be a sign that you need some improvements there, or that that was just being completely misinterpreted. But either way, that can be a staffing issue, and you need to. I think it's fair to evaluate every piece of this. I mean, every single area needs to be reevaluated in some way, shape, or form, and we've seen it at the highest levels, obviously, because now you've got the way that press conference went when they introduced everybody was more than just putting everybody out there to make the message clear across the board. It was also to make sure that they pretty clearly defined what everybody's role in this is going to be. And they read it out to everybody. And so it's very, no secrets here kind of thing. Like, this is what these people are going to be doing, and this is what the job looks like. So that's great for those 5 people, but I think that you can expand upon that. And I don't need the job description of every member of the Flyers front office or the scouting departments or everything like that. But I think that means that if you're going to go into that much detail for those 5 people and what their job is and what their role in this leadership group is, then it means that you're going to do the same thing, or hopefully it means you're going to do the same thing on an organizational level from top to bottom. And you've got a coach who is very interested in that from the player side, because sure sounds like he knows what he wants and what he doesn't want, or who he thinks is with him and who he thinks isn't. that's going to be communicated to the general manager and the president. And it certainly is on the general manager and the president to work together, maybe more so than the coach, but the coach is going to have say, as we've talked about, in terms of going the direction with the rest of the organization, what all these other departments look. That's what that's mainly what the president typically does, is assembles the group, the whole group, not just the 5 people we've been talking about, but everybody else who plays a role in this. So that's the areas that I'm interested to see how much evolution there is. Usually, and I don't want to speculate when we're going to get this per se, or if we're going to get it at all, but I know that over the years, typically there's kind of a slightly pre-training camp kind of news drop where they go into some of the promotions that are made or things like that, and that was when we found out about Macaulay got promoted, I believe, to director of player personnel prior to last season. Right. That's where we find those things out later on about who's getting what, and maybe some changes within or any new hires or things like that. So I think it's something for later down the line. To be honest, outside of doing the PR tour, that's the work that can be done right now. The big reason that they're doing the PR tour in the first place, particularly Keith Jones, is because that's what you can do right now. They're not going to be able to, while the playoffs are still going on, you're not making a trade involving Kevin Hayes. You're not doing any of these other things yet. You definitely can't. I mean, you're doing draft work behind the scenes, but you're not making that pick yet until after the season's over either. So we can't talk about any sort of action until we get through the Stanley Cup final. So for the time being, the best thing you can do is continue to kind of remain vigilant in terms of your pushing of this message and getting it across to the fan base and having it heard everywhere. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen Keith Jones and his picture pop up on doing another appearance here or there. And you get some of them, like you sit there and you go, okay, he's on NHL Network. He's, all those types of things. But then, I've seen him pop up on a bunch of other stuff too that sometimes doesn't have near as much to do with the hockey world or is maybe more of an all sports kind of thing or whatever. And it's like, okay, this is really going above and beyond in terms of making sure that everybody out there knows what kind of message is going around. It just goes to show you how much the words I want to say are damage control, but it's even less that. It just seems like it's more repairing than anything. Repairing the relationships is really what this is.
Yeah, no, Kevin, you're right. They paraded him out there. Don't get me wrong. Part of it, yes, he does. He's been around the league and he has all these contacts, and he's probably seen more and can evaluate more teams better than a lot of the scouts out there because he called those games. He's up in the box. He's privy to information that we don't get, and that's fine. But more importantly, look at the fracture that was with the team ownership and the fan base. That has been the hardest. That's the thing that's been affected the most. Look how many people dropped their season tickets, and all the way they felt they were treated by the team when tickets. They were giving away free tickets and then selling, it was just, it was a slap in the face of season ticket holders. So the Jonesy hire is not necessarily a bad hire, but most importantly, it's to get that fan base back. He's here to say, hey, look, he's the rah-rah guy that you want in your locker room that gets everybody fired up before a game. He's here to get the fan base fired up about being a Flyer again. That the new orange or whatever, there's a new orange. It's to get people excited about Flyers hockey again, because nobody, and I don't think anybody 5-10 years ago would have said in 10 years the Flyers fans they wouldn't care, to become indifferent, I think is the best word. And that's how some Flyers fans were. A lot of them gave up their season tickets because of it. And I think that's it. This is going to be his greatest role and his greatest, challenge, I think, is to get that fan base back, because they're going to need that.
And I definitely want to throw in one note that I had from the press conference as well, because, one of the guys that we haven't talked a whole lot about, we've really been focused on the big three of this leadership group, but one of the guys we haven't talked about as much is Dan Hilferty. And, right away when he started to speak at this press conference, you got to realize that, and I know you guys know it well, but I'm kind of more speaking to the listeners at this point, realize that it had been, if we're talking May, when we get this whole big press conference and all that stuff, it had been, 16, 17 months since Dave Scott last appeared in front of anybody. So the invisible ownership causes a lot of stir in the fan base as well. And here's Dan Hilferty coming out. And first of all, I think, obviously making a really good impression. He's a businessman, so I'm not surprised that he knows how to kind of play to an audience, so to speak. But talking about being present and saying, I'm going to be around and I'm going to be there. And in fairness to him, saying the right thing in terms of not trying to be Ed Snyder 2.0, basically, but being present is important, because I think it's been too long for a fan base that was so used to present ownership to not have anybody that they feel like they can go to or relate to or whatever. And one of the ways on one of our recent YWT episodes, I said it this way. I said, think about the pecking order on, when the cameras are going around during a conference final, let's just say, because that was the area we were, I think, previewing at the time. They score a big goal. You put the camera on the celebration. You pan to the bench. If they win a game in overtime, right, then it goes to the celebration. You pan to the bench. The coach is pumping his fist. And where's the third shot go? The third shot went up to the owner's box where Ed Snyder was high-fiving fans, right? And that needs to come back a little bit. They don't need one guy who is that ever-present and that, and maybe that outspoken to the media per se, but somebody who at least can make more of a connection and be readily available for when the time comes. That to me is huge, because it comes down to, sure, you need all the knowledge you can get on the hockey operations side of things. You need to have insight on the game. You need to know what you're doing. And we're going to find out if if Keith Jones and Danny Briere know what they're doing in short order here. But to have, ownership, because I expressed this also on the episode of YWT. A lot of, with a lot of the sell the team comments and things like that, you don't necessarily want Comcast to not own the team from a monetary standpoint, because you want funding to get the best of the best in every other area. Yeah, you have to navigate a salary cap for the players, but that having a company like that behind you allows you to hire the best coach, allows you to go out and get the best, try to get the best scouting department, best analytics department, best medical staff, all of it. That's what allows you to be even more successful when you're actually, financially backed by something that pours into it and feels like it gets its return. Because think about it. You play a couple of playoff series, you're getting a pretty big return at the end of the year, right? That's what builds the success. It's what allows you to keep spending the money on the other things that go into making a winning organization beyond the players. But I also think you can't have Comcast be the owner of the team and not have anybody that people feel like they can relate to, because there's no connection between the fans and a business. There's a connection between the fans and a representative of the ownership. And I compared it to, at least in the city in Philadelphia, for years, everybody's known that Jeffrey Lurie owns the Eagles and is the individual owning the Eagles. But the Phillies were owned by a bunch of different people until all of a sudden, when they went and got Bryce Harper and John Middleton's behind the whole operation. Now, all of a sudden, everybody knows who John Middleton is. And when things don't seem like they're going right, they're putting his name out there. Hey, John Middleton, put your money out there. We need, they need this, they need that. Go ahead, get behind this, all that stuff, right? I think that the Flyers fans need somebody like that they can connect with more than just Comcast sell the team, which is all you were getting with Dave Scott, right? Like, that's all you were getting. You never saw Dave Scott. He never answered any questions. He never talked about anything. So it is what it is. So you get Dan Hilferty, who by all accounts sounds like he's going to be a man of the people. And if you're going to be a man of the people, then that means you're going to be a soundboard for the things that are working and the things that are not working. And hopefully listen to a lot of things. And I'm not saying you need to listen in terms of every fan is going to have a good idea in terms of direction of the hockey team itself, but listen to what kind of has gotten them away from coming down to games. And a big part of it obviously is winning product. That's a huge part of it. Winning product is what's going to draw people in. But certainly in the meantime, while you're building the winning product, listen to your fans and find out what's going to help them connect with these, even with a few of the players who are part of that big picture. When Tyson Forrester is playing, presumably next season, playing at the NHL level full time, what can you do to make him a little bit more connected to the fan base? Because people seem to like him in the handful of games he got, right? There's a guy that people maybe feel like we're going to go through this with him, not wait for him. We're going to go through this process with him. And same with, I look at the team now and I just sit there and I go, who's on there that you really feel like you can connect with in the long term? I mean, even Carter Hart is a guy who for the longest time everybody thought that, but there's questions about that, whether he's going to be here beyond the contract and whether they're going to trade him and all that stuff like that. That's it. The debate of whether they should or not is a whole nother conversation, but it's hard to latch on to players when their future is unknown. So if you get guys who their future is a little bit more known and can actually promote them, because right now the thing you have the most to promote is a head coach. That was the guy who was getting plastered all over the marketing materials, not any player. So you got to get it to the players, and certainly ownership need, to create a fan experience and embrace what, from a business side, embrace whatever opportunities they can get in terms of welcoming fans back in, following through on this big PR tour about building it the right way. Well, there's more to building it the right way than just the hockey team. It's building the whole franchise back the right way and doing what it takes to understand what the fans want. And hopefully that's where Hilferty's presence to me means a lot. So I hope that has a huge impact going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think you spoke to it very well, because I think the apathy is what they're really, really worried about. This is what Jones seems to have a sense of urgency about. The Flyers are getting to the point where they didn't matter. I mean, if you trace back to when they let go of AV and you had that famous or infamous now moment where you had the blank checkbook and the aggressive retool of verbiage, it's been a disaster pretty much ever since. Scott's basically been absent because it's not his business. I think back to the which was the Hockey News Power issue, and they interviewed Dave Scott a couple of years ago. He had a very short blurb about the team, and then he started talking about all the other businesses that Comcast Spectacor was involved in, and he seemed to have more enthusiasm for that. He's a cable guy, and of course Fletcher. I mean, this is a guy who was afraid to say the word rebuild in his own admission at the town hall. I mean, the communication, it's not only speaking with one voice, it's just speaking it all. So this is one of the reasons I was so, I guess, praised so much what the Rangers did. And it took the Flyers a long time to understand that if Snyder was still around, God rest his soul, you wouldn't have needed a letter at all. He would have been very clear what needed to be done. So now they're kind of doing what they can do with, like you said, with Dan Hilferty can't try to be Ed Snyder, but they do have to get to the point where, we matter. We remember when the team matters, and we're going to get to the point where you're going to care because we're going to work to get to that point.
And let's be clear about something with Hilferty too, because like I said, he's not trying to be Ed Snyder 2.0, and that was also at his own admission. He's not going to be exactly what Ed Snyder was, but he is basically an Ed Snyder representation, so to speak, right? Like for all of those years, it was Ed Snyder would speak when the time came for stuff like this. And if he can come out, because the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm trying to picture, what would it be like if Ed Snyder was still here and it got to this point, and if you had to get up in front, because even toward the end of things, Snyder was still hardened towards, not needing fresh perspectives and culture changes and things like that. So you can still be kind of hardened to that, no matter how much you realize that you need to go through with it. And Hilferty really kind of cut through the whole thing and just got to the, cut to the chase, get to the point. It's a rebuild, and to hear everybody bring it up. I didn't hear one person shy away from the word in that 5-person panel, so that's important to have that messaging across and to hear it from the top down also. This isn't just, okay, great. Briere had said it months ago, right? Briere got the job, or at least in the interim, and said it right away. And the coach has been saying it for a few months, so it was kind of like a slow progression. Okay, the coach was there. Now the acting general manager is there. They're without a president at the moment, and let's get ownership there. And for it to all finally be coming together and to do it that way, I think it helps create trust for Hilferty, to be honest, because there obviously wasn't any trust for Dave Scott. So it helps create a little bit of trust that you recognize the situation. And again, for me, and I've said this all along, and I've written this all along, that this is all well and good today because this is all that they can do. This is why the tour is going on the way that it is because all you can do is talk about what you need to do and where it needs to go and rebuilds and all of that type of stuff. But how you go about doing it is how we're really going to judge this down the stretch. So, when the rebuild is wrapping up, or in whatever terms of a wrap up for on the rebuild it is, however many years down the line it is, it's only going to be judged based on what they did, not on what they said at the start of it. So it's a great first impression. And I will say, the press conference felt kind of vintage for the Flyers in the sense that there was gravitas behind it. It wasn't just, let's put Danny Briere in front of a microphone for 20 minutes at the training facility. To do it on the Wells Fargo Center floor, to make it a spectacle, was certainly kind of out of the old playbook, so to speak.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what, maybe that was what was needed, because again, you're trying to build any level of optimism. And like I said, I think for me, cautious optimism is fair in this, because you've got to at least see where it goes. I mean, it's either going to turn out to be a great triumph. It's going to be one of those stories that they make a movie about in however many years, or it's going to be a train wreck that you can't turn your eyes away from. You're going to watch it as it happens, so, but one way or another, it's a group that's clearly defined that they're in it together, all for one, one for all. And if it goes down, they're all going down probably. So, that's, at the very least, that's what you've got going for you, is that everybody's on board with where it's got to try to go. And now we wait and see what happens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess the question, Shep was talking about it earlier about how the Flyers could get back into the first round. Let me hit this from a different angle. The Flyers do have some players that are worthy in the eyes of some that could draw them back into the first round for a second first round pick. Maybe a player like Ivan Provorov or a Travis Konechny. If the Flyers are willing to go there, if they think that with their timeline, or maybe Carter Hart, and of course there are young players that haven't kind of bursted out in I guess teams like Los Angeles. I'm obviously crazy about Byfield, but Alex Turcotte is a guy who's had a lot of injuries, has been really slow out of the gate. And, there might be some opportunities for the Flyers to do that. And I'm wondering if is anybody on the Flyers roster that you think they might part with capable of putting them in a situation where they could get into that late first round for some of the teams we talked about earlier?
I mean, not specifically in terms of concrete, discussions or anything like that. I don't have anything like that, but is there anybody, but is there anybody on the roster? I think it goes back to the conversations we were having as soon as they kind of admitted they were going down this road, which is everything's got to be on the table. I think you've got to listen to every possibility, especially if any of those teams you're talking about toward the back end of the first round can approach with a different a different viewpoint and give you, an offer where maybe it involves a late first round pick, and you're talking about moving a player of that magnitude. If that's out there, I think you have to listen, and I would certainly, I would certainly say Provorov and Konechny are two players to watch in that, because I think, it's no secret that that's not the first time that their names have come up in the past. And I don't think that this offseason is going to be anything different. I think that there will be calls. I think you've got to think about it long and hard about whether or not a deal like that is worth it. Certainly, if it helps you get back into the first round this year, I think it probably is worth it, because of the fact that you're even further moving along the lines of trying to build this thing from the ground up and draft players that you think are going to have an impact. And like we talked about already, if it allows you to keep your seventh pick in the first place and then do something else in the first round, well, the seventh pick is where you're going to try to make the big impact. And if you get back into the mid-20s, let's say, or lower, late 20s with something, moving a player like Provorov or Konechny, who knows what you can get. Maybe that's where you get your find. Maybe your David Pastrnak is out there waiting to be found in the late first round or something like that. Who knows? So that's where I think it might be worth it to take those chances. And if you're going to build it like that, go that direction, because you don't need to work, not even you don't need to, but you got players like that who it's going to be a question mark whether or not they're part of the long haul with this rebuild, how long this rebuild lasts. I've said it about Carter Hart a little bit, and I think Hart's probably a little bit more of one that you hesitate on because of his age. He's not past 25 yet, so it's a little different for him. But these guys that are past 25, you start to question it, because you go, if it takes 3 years to get to a spot where you feel good, then yeah, they have value to your own team. If it takes 5, they're in their 30s. What value, Is it more valuable to then get capital now, or is it more valuable to hold on to them until they're in their 30s because you think that they're going to still help you on the other side of this thing? That's what you have to ask yourself. And it's a hard thing to determine, because, we can all try to pretend we have a crystal ball about what the next 5 years is going to bring for the franchise. Nobody knows completely. You could trade, you could be trading one of those two players for a first round pick that you think is going to amount to something big. And, turns out to be a player like German Rubasov, let's say, who you get in that same kind of area of the draft. You think you've got something that you can build and work with, and it ultimately doesn't work out. That happens too. So you have to be very careful about what you decide to do, especially with how certain players in that age group, if you're in that age group right now, if you're in 25 to 27, then you have to be careful about what the next 3 to 5 years mean to you, and whether or not you think that the better long-term play is keeping guys like that or getting draft capital. And I tend to lean more toward the draft capital than keeping players in the here and now.
Yep. I mean, we've heard a lot about, what are the Flyers going to do with the minutes that Provorov plays? And I'm thinking, and it kind of leads me in the next direction. Look, the Flyers can get into free agency. It's just going to have to be mid-tier. You might want to call them Band-Aids, but that's how you're going to have to approach this. If you really want to rebuild, like you were saying, you got to take a chance at getting higher end talent. And the only way to do it, the best way to do it is to either, trade and get lucky with a guy like Owen Tippett, who hadn't broken out yet, or to get into the first round or second round of the draft.
And the other key part of that equation is, if you go out and sign free agents to fill out your roster, low cost 1 year deal can be huge for you if you do it the right way and you work your way through to the deadline. When you get to that point roughly at the deadline where, maybe there is a guy, let's just hypothetically say, and I think he'll have a shot at making the team out of camp potentially, but let's say Bobby Brink. You come to the point where the deadline arrives and now he's ready to come up. So the best thing to do is move one of these guys on an expiring contract. You can even eat half the salary, even if it's only a $2 million, $2.5 million contract. Eat half the salary anyway. And somebody who's playoff bound, somebody who's getting desperate, may throw you something that is more than what you thought the player would be worth to begin with. Maybe you get a second for them. Seconds could be just as promising if you can get a bunch of seconds in a certain draft and then say, you know what, we're looking at 3 second-round picks in that draft. Let's say they somehow or other were to do that and they get a couple of second-round picks. You could package a couple picks, and next thing you know, you're back in the first round. That's how you have to approach the rebuild stage of this. Is the more picks you have, the more chances you have to package things together to get higher in the draft and get players of impact. And that's the way you've got to approach it. So certainly with free agency, like if you can do similar, the one contract that I knew when it was signed last offseason that was going to be moved, was going to amount to something, was when Max Domi signed in Chicago. And it was 1 year, $3 million. And I'm like, that's easy to move. It's so easy to move that contract. If you are a team like Chicago, who at the midpoint of the year at the trade deadline says, fine, we'll eat half of the salary and trade him to a team like Dallas, who has playoff aspirations. You got it, and you get something back in return for a player that you signed to a 1 year deal. That's a good approach to take if you want to try to, acquire some draft capital potentially in a hurry. If you can get players, and you know what, maybe that's a good area where Tortorella can come in and have some big influence, because if he goes out or he influences some of those decisions, bring this guy on for a year. He's not a long-term fix, but he's a guy I can get a lot out of in 1 year, so that when trade deadline time comes calling, Danny Briere, I'm going to make your job that much easier because you're not going to have trouble trying to move this guy. That's where this teamwork thing can work, because you get a guy like, get a player in who Tortorella can work with. He's on a 1 year deal. He's easy to trade. Briere gets to pick up the phone at the deadline and say, listen, I got a guy who, look how he's playing here. And he's playing second line here. He'll play third line for your team, something like that. Mm-hmm. You have to explore those possibilities. And that's how you're going to get capital in a faster way. It's really the only way I can think of that you're going to get capital back that you've traded so much of away in the last several years. It's the only way you're going to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I guess the last one from me, Kevin, let me give you some names and what we already agree that Tyson Foerster is probably going to be here at the start of the year. It would take a really bad camp for him to get sent down. But you have to think that among Ronnie Attard, Bobby Brink, Egor Zamula, and of course Sam Urson, you have to wonder what's going to happen with what's his name, Sandstrom, whether he's even going to, be with the team at a training camp. But do you expect every one of them to get a really long look?
A long look, yes. I don't know if I expect every single one of them to make the team out of camp. I think Zamula needs a little bit more work, so I wouldn't be surprised if they sent him down at the start of the year. Attard's going to be interesting because I do think that Attard getting to play in the World Championships is a big deal for him. I think that says a lot about maybe some of his development at the minor league level, and so he'll probably be a tough call. Brink's going to be a tough call at the start of the year just because, again, with the full season not being able to play completely last season, you got to kind of still build him back up. Forster, I think, totally agree. I think Forster, it would take an awful lot for him to not make the team out of camp because Tortorella just loved what he brought to the team when he played at the NHL level in that small sample that he had. And I think he would have to come in showing that he wasn't physically up to the challenge of NHL players, but they're going to probably play. Like, I can see them playing him in the preseason the way that they were playing Ola Lixel in the preseason last year, and just continue to throw him out there, get him into games, and see if this is free. I mean, they played Forster a lot in the preseason last year too, don't get me wrong, but it was obvious he was going to go down at the beginning of the year, and he worked his way up to the call-up. I similarly to throw in, and Lixel's another name, by the way, that should still be in the running for some stuff going forward because he was another really effective forward for Lehigh Valley this year. And I would have to say that another player who got a little bit of a taste of the NHL this past year, who I think is going to get a decent look, is Elliot Desnoyers.
I was going to bring him up if you hadn't.
Right. He's got to get a look in a pretty big way because that's another guy who, especially for somebody on the younger side, and that's the pros and cons of building a team kind of in the early stages of this is you can go out and sign a bunch of free agents to 1-year deals to round out your roster, but you want to give young players a chance to play effective minutes. And Desnoyers would be one of those guys that not only do I think would be able to get effective minutes, but would also just benefits from the style that John Tortorella is all about. I mean, he's a motor guy, he just keeps going and doesn't stop. So I don't see how he doesn't fit what they're looking for. And the only question that you'd have with him in camp is he the same player that and better than what they got out of him this year when he was up? Because, certainly. And I thought that one of the things I thought of too was, his playoff, even though the Phantom's playoff run was brief, it's, he had some moments in that playoff run nonetheless, where it's like, he's stepping up in key situations down the stretch of the regular season, things like that. So to do that at the AHL level now, especially, and again, they're kind of bringing it full circle again, because you brought up Jamie Benn, who was a 5th round pick, and that's what Elliot Desnoyers was. Yeah. So, if you can get a find out of one of those guys and he can be effective, you got to give a look. But I think he's got to qualify as well. And then, there's a whole host of other players that are down at Arison. I didn't really mention Arison much either. I'm curious to see how that goes, because I think it's no secret Tortorella liked him a lot, obviously, and would have played him even more frequently if the Phantoms weren't making a big playoff push. Yeah. I think he's ready to be the backup of this team. Yeah. But the question is, what do you do with Felix Sandstrom? And I don't know, obviously he's got a more complicated, from a minor league standpoint, more complicated contract than Arison does. So you have to weigh that factor, and goaltending depth is a problem for them at the moment, because they have a handful of prospects, but they're not to the minor league level yet. So because of that, you really have to decide what the Flyers had the benefit of, if one of the other two, when they had Sandstrom up as the backup to Hart, if one of the two went down, Arison was waiting in the wings, and yet that was your third. But beyond that, they really didn't have anybody, they're not like Vegas. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. They're not like Vegas, who can get to the 4th guy and feel comfortable, and get comfortable. So that's where they are with that. So it's hard for me to see them trading Sandstrom or moving him in some capacity, because you really need to have at least 3 available to you. It's just a matter of, and early season's not the time to try to put a goalie on waivers, because it's a risky time when everybody's kind of flirting with the possibility of who can they bring in, if you only have two goalies and you see another guy out there on waivers who can be your third, you may go there. That it's risky to put a guy like that on waivers. So just something to consider as they move forward. But those are, a ton of guys like that. And there's even more that you can go into, because another name that I think of who kind of got a brief little period with the Phantoms was Emil Andre. I think.
Oh yeah, I was just going to mention
you're going to have to watch him next year. I don't think there's a chance he starts in the NHL because it was just too small of a sample in the AHL, but he sure looked poised to play a significant role at the AHL level. And I think that matters a lot for his development and moving forward with him for where he could be. Because I do think he's got an NHL career ahead of him. I'll say that much.
Yeah. I mean, he anybody who had SHL experience, it's one of maybe the third best league in the world, So Kev, before we let you go, Cutter Gauthier, 6 goals, 2 assists, 8 points in 7 games. And everybody's singing his praises. What's your impression? I don't know if you've had a chance to watch too much of the whole games or just the highlights or what have you.
Probably more highlights than whole games, because some of them, not going to lie, I mean, the time difference is a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
I know that their quarterfinal game is on Thursday morning at 9:20 a.m. our time anyway. It's totally different. It's mid-afternoon for them in where they're playing over there in the World Championships. But I did catch the last game of group play pretty much the last half of the first period on. I want to say maybe even only 5 minutes in, maybe is when I actually had it turned on. So I watched pretty much the majority of that game. I've seen a lot of the highlights. One thing I noticed, because I've seen a lot of the goals, and obviously he's got a really good shot and he's got the offensive chops, no question about it. First of all, I guess the first thing that impressed me in the game that I just watched him play, which was against the second best team in their group, by the way, which is Sweden. They had a power play pretty early on, and by the end of the thing, he had 5 shots on goal in the game already, and the game was maybe 7 minutes old. Like to the point where they were telling you, I believe it was Brian Engblom was doing the color for that game, and he's sitting there telling you somebody else on USA needs to take a shot because it's all going through Gauthier right now. But it was kind of refreshing to see a guy who was shot happy in that situation on a power play, was just willing to let it go from wherever. But he later on, and I want to say it was in the first period still of that game, he had a rush through the neutral zone where he just hit another gear. Like, his skating is really good, and that's encouraging. I had seen a couple of clips of him, some BC clips of him being able to, turn on the burners a little bit and pick up speed through the neutral zone and get an opportunity like that. But to really watch him do it from blue line to blue line and go into the offensive zone and on the attack with a lot of speed, from a forward perspective, and as much as we can debate where they are in development and Gauthier and Juracek from last year's draft and all that stuff, Gauthier looks like an impact player. And that's at least a starting point for a team that doesn't feel like they have much of that right now. I see a guy who can be an impact player. And I think the other impressive part is I'm hearing his name an awful lot in this whole thing, watching their games. And then, the next minute after he gets off the ice, I'm hearing Alex Tuck, hearing established NHL players that he's playing with and playing against. And that's important. Playing at the college level is a little bit like that, because you're not just playing against, kids of high school age, basically. And like in the CHL, you're getting that experience against college age kids. You're getting, the 18-year-old who's a freshman is playing 22-year-olds. There's an age gap and there's a physicality gap in there. But here he is doing it after his freshman season. And forget topping out at 22 or 23 years old. You got guys who are established veterans in the NHL who he's doing it against. And I believe, when group play finally wound down and is over with as they go to the quarters, he was second in the tournament in goals behind Dominik Kubalik. Like, yeah, that's pretty impressive if you're second in a tournament in a tournament like this in goals with so many NHLers who eventually make their way over and start to play when their seasons are over. So I'm definitely impressed by him. I can only imagine what he's going to look like playing at the college level after going through an experience like this. I mean, I can only imagine what he's going to be like once he actually gets, this is like extended training for him to begin with. Then he's going to train for the college season. He's going to be a sophomore instead of being a freshman at that point. So he'll have that first year of experience under his belt. He'll still be playing against guys who are, 21, 22, 23. And I got to imagine for all the good things that we saw in his freshman season and the numbers that looked so good, it's going to get better. And he's going to be, I got to imagine that next year is probably it for, it's got to probably be it for him at the college level.
Kevin, that Boston College team is going to be incredible.
With the draft prospects that are going, coming from these programs that are going to go into Boston College.
It's ridiculous.
It's incredible. It's
because there's Smith, Leonard, and Perot.
Smith, Leonard, Perot. Hey, who knows? But he could be. Flyers could be potentially drafting a future line mate, and they get to play a couple of years together too. So that'd be awesome.
Absolutely, and I can't wait to see what it looks like. Especially, I got to imagine with the level of talent, especially for how high up all three of those guys are in all these mock drafts and things like that. I got to imagine that Boston College is going to be back on the radar for a long run when it comes to the Frozen Four and all that stuff. And I think that that's part of the thinking with Gauthier, because I think Gauthier probably, let's put it this way. If he doesn't feel it by now with the way he's played in this World Championships, he's got to be feeling it. He had to have felt it some point in time that he's ready for a jump in talent level and a jump in competition, but he's going to go back because I think he wants to accomplish something at that level too. He's going to have a shot to do that. Pretty much probably a guarantee he's on World Juniors again. All of that. That's going to be great it's just going to be great for his experience level to be able to be a part of all of that again and to do this a second year around and just continue to grow from there. So I think that's all good for him. And how can you not notice what he's doing? I feel like every morning I was waking up and finding another highlight of him doing something pretty spectacular. He's not giving you the 6 goals he's got. They're not cheap. These are goal scorers' goals. He's doing some really impressive things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot. There's something to look forward to. I think one of those got by the French goaltender. Okay, all right, I'll give you that. But
one of them.
Yeah, the acceleration is really impressive, and I think it's an improvement over what we saw last year. And listen, I don't know if he's blue chip, but he's the best prospect they have. So we're going to put a wrap on it from there, Chef, unless you have something else for Kevin.
No, great stuff. Enjoyed it. Always enjoy our conversations with Kevin.
Yeah, so Kev, we got to get the rundown from you where people can find you and all the things you got going on right now.
Sure thing. So you guys said it off the top, 973ESPN.com, 973ESPN.com, and on Twitter at 973ESPN. Continuing to put all my stuff up there, sportstalkphilly.com. I have a lot up there with the Flyers coverage as well. The You Would Think podcast, a lot more playoff driven conversation right now than Flyers driven. Although our last episode revolved around a lot of the president and GM discussion and things like that in the press conference and all that. So, going to shift gears probably again moving forward and go back to playoff conversation until we have some more concrete stuff to talk about on the Flyers side and whatever happens. But certainly, a new episode coming to be determined, depending on how quickly these teams decide to end the conference finals, I guess.
That is true.
Fantastic. Kevin, thanks so much for coming by, and we'll see you again soon down the road, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me, guys. Always appreciate it.
All right. You take care.
Later.
You guys too.
Okay, so Chef, I just want to let the people know that the schedule of events, because it is an off-season preview. I'd be derelict in my duty if I didn't just let people know that between June 4th and June 10th is going to be the NHL Scouting Combine. The 26th of June will be the NHL Awards. The 28th and 29th is the NHL Draft. And of course, Saturday, July 1st at noon, NHL Free Agency. And soon after all of that will be the development camps where we see some of the kids that the Flyers may have drafted. And we're off and running all over again. Final thoughts?
No, I think it's great. If anything else, the one thing you could take now, and I think I've said it as a joke before, that whole thing about Schrodinger's cat You know, this is Schrodinger's Flyers right now. They could be really, really fun, or this could be a super train wreck. It's just good right now to have some optimism, and you know what? It's okay to have optimism. It's okay to like be emotionally invested in your team again, and to think about something good that could happen. And if you want to argue that with me, or just dispute anything we've said tonight, just reach out to me at Chef the Left B. That's Chef. The number 2, the left B on Twitter, and I will gladly rebuke you.
Okay. Well, I mean, you can compliment Chef. He does take compliments as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, no problem. You can catch me, Isaiah, at Isaiah, ISAIAH _520. Isaiah, don't forget the _520, and of course the O&B Puckcast at O&B Puck at O&B Puck, if I can spit it out, and of course on Getter at O&B Puckcast at O&B Puckcast. So until next time, everybody, take care.